cryptocurrency price manipulation, all the news from E3, AI needs high school girls, and why investors are throwing money at scooter companies. All that and so much more tech news coming up on Tech News Weekly.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Tech News Weekly is brought to you by Cashfly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Tech News Weekly, episode 36, recorded Thursday, June 14th, 2018. This episode of Tech News Weekly is brought to you by LastPass. Join over 33,000 businesses and start managing and securing your company's passwords today. Learn more at lastpass.com/twit.
Welcome to the show. This is Tech News Weekly, where we talk to the people making and breaking all the tech news. I am Megan Maroney.
And I'm Jason Howell. And, this whole Bitcoin, this whole cryptocurrency thing, it's a hot fad, right?
Yes, it's a hot fad.
No, it's this thing that I've been trying to really understand. I've been getting more and more interested in it. I think everybody is right now, obviously, if they haven't already become Bitcoin millionaires, who, by the way, a month ago, I got into a conversation with like 5 Bitcoin millionaires. It was fascinating. Anyways, really kind of makes you feel like maybe you've missed the wave to a certain degree, but we're going to talk all about it right now. Bitcoin has been riding this roller coaster for the past year. With it, so have those who invested early. Like I said, along with that came new interest in cryptocurrency, helped in no small part by the meteoric rise in value through the end of last year and early 2018. But a new report seems to point to market manipulation. And joining us to discuss what may have happened is Nathanial Popper from the New York Times, also author of Digital Gold, Bitcoin and the Inside Story of the Misfits and Millionaires Trying to Reinvent Money. Welcome to the show, Nathanial.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. So first, even those who might be kind of sort of familiar with cryptocurrency understand what Bitcoin is, but this report in particular talks about another cryptocurrency called Tether. I mean, there are so many cryptocurrencies out there. Talk a little bit about what Tether is specifically.
Sure. So Tether is essentially a cryptocurrency that was created, essentially invented by one of the largest cryptocurrency exchanges called Bitfinex. That's the name of the exchange. And they essentially created Tether to be a cryptocurrency that would one Tether would always be worth $1. And so this was a way to move money around the cryptocurrency ecosystem. If you couldn't, move $1,000 from this exchange Bitfinex to another exchange in the United States, if the banks wouldn't do that, you could move Tether. So essentially you had this dollar that operated like a cryptocurrency. And it became very popular. It became a very popular way to essentially trade cryptocurrencies. If you wanted to move in and out of Bitcoin or Ether or any of these other cryptocurrencies, you could trade the kind of volatile Bitcoin for Tether and have your money in essentially dollar form, so that the value wouldn't keep jumping around. And so it became a very popular way to trade other cryptocurrencies and to move money around between cryptocurrency exchanges.
So I have read, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Tether is supposedly backed by a reserve of U.S. dollars. And if this is true, how can anyone prove or disprove that it actually is?
Right. So the idea with Tether and what this exchange, Bitfinex, has always promised is that in order to generate a tether and give a tether to a customer, that customer has to give them $1, and that dollar will be in a bank account. So essentially, every tether is backed up by real money. That's the idea here. It's a little bit like the gold standard. You know, for every dollar that's out there, there's $1 of gold. That's a similar concept here. Now, there have been a lot of questions about whether this exchange, Bitfinex, really has the dollars to back up the tethers. And this exchange Bitfinex is sort of typical, or perhaps even a classic case of this sort of unregulated cryptocurrency exchange. It seems to be registered in the Caribbean. It has offices in Asia. It's never quite clear where it is, what it is. And so there hasn't been a whole lot of transparency around the backing of Tether, whether it really is fully backed up by dollars. And there has been a hue and cry over the last 2 years as Tether has grown bigger for Bitfinex and Tether to bring in an auditor to say, I certify that that Bitfinex or Tether has, the dollars to back up the number of tethers that exist. And, I think a real auditing firm probably could do that. Last year, Tether said that they had an auditing firm that was working on that. And sort of suddenly that auditing firm backed out after several months of allegedly working on it. And that raised a lot of eyebrows. And so still today, there's no real sort of firm evidence out there that these tethers are backed up. And that has led to this suspicion in the crypto community that this exchange, Bitfinex, is basically just sort of printing money. And that's really the kind of background to this whole concern about manipulation. There's this fear out there that, when the price goes down, Bitfinex just sort of prints some dollars, prints some Tether dollars, and buys enough Bitcoin to push the price up. That's the fear, and that fear has been out there for some time. I mean, I reported on it late last year. And so this is a pretty widespread concern in the cryptocurrency community, this idea that you have this Bitcoin exchange that has an interest in having high Bitcoin prices that can basically just print new money to buy Bitcoin and push the price up. And so that's where this new report this week that came from two academics at the University of Texas, that's the sort of background to it.
So that's the background. What are the specifics, like tangible evidence? What are the things that they point to as evidence of this actually happening? If it's been suspected up until now, and now the researchers are, of course, publishing about this, do they have specific things to point to say, actually, it is happening, and here's
right? And this sort of goes to the one of the unique traits of cryptocurrencies, which is that you have this record of every transaction that's ever occurred, and you can see every wallet and every transaction that's happened. And so through sort of sophisticated modeling and grouping, you can kind of figure out, okay, these addresses over here are associated with Bitfinex or Tether. And we can see when people were using Tether. And you can also, by the way, see every transaction with Tether, because Tether also exists on a blockchain. So you have this record of all the transactions. And what the academics did is they looked at when Tether moved to different exchanges and how that changed the price of Bitcoin immediately thereafter. Not only the price of Bitcoin, but the price of Ether and a number of other virtual currencies. And in essence, what they saw was that when new Tether were created and moved to other exchanges, they were immediately used to push up the prices of several virtual currencies on those exchanges. And I mean, the way they did this was quite complicated. It involves a lot of sort of statistical analysis. The paper itself was 66 pages long. And there's been a lot of debate since it came out. But essentially what they found was, right after Tether would flow, large quantities of Tether would be created and flow into these exchanges, the prices of a whole bunch of cryptocurrencies would be pushed up. And not only that, but these small periods when Tether were issued actually accounted for most of the rise in the price of Bitcoin last year, and actually even more of the rise in some of these other competing virtual currencies.
So from reading all these headlines, it really seems like Bitcoin is pretty easily manipulated. But then you say that there's records of all these transactions. And I mean, we're getting better and better and quicker and quicker at like going through large amounts of data. So Would you say that it really actually is less easy to manipulate it because there's a record?
This is the funny thing about Bitcoin. Sort of with all the questions and concerns that people have, it's always both the thing that people worry about and the opposite of the thing that people worry about. So, people always worry about Bitcoin as anonymous. It allows you to buy drugs and send ransom payments. And if you use it right, it is anonymous. But on the other hand, it's very unanonymous because you have this record of every transaction you've ever made. So it's both the most anonymous and the most unanonymous type of money. And that applies to this kind of question of transparency too. You can tell a lot by looking at the blockchain and the record of all these transactions, but we don't at the end of the day know exactly who owned which accounts. So we might be able to see a wallet and know that was a wallet associated with Bitfinex, but only Bitfinex's internal records probably know who really in fact owned that account, the name of that person. And so that's this, the way in which Bitcoin is both very anonymous and very not anonymous at the same time. You can tell a lot. There's a lot of records that don't exist for normal money and normal kinds of trading. But at the same time, there's a lot you can't tell. And so these professors were pretty careful to say, this isn't sort of inside emails showing the manipulation. It's just showing these patterns that look strikingly like manipulation. And it's worth noting that the professor who led this, a professor of finance at the University of Texas, has spotted manipulation in other financial markets in the past and ended up being right about those cases. So, that's why we decided to write about it. This guy has a track record, and the sort of academics and economists who looked at this said that the evidence that he's putting forward seemed credible, but like so much in Bitcoin, there's always sort of mysteries floating there at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And then, the conversation kind of comes around, and especially lately around regulation. The SEC has made opinions even in the last 24 hours that are very important to, the evolution of cryptocurrency and everything. Is that the missing component here in this case? Like, if Tether was actually doing this, were they doing something that they should not have been, and would regulation address that?
I mean, I think that certainly, by the way, we're talking about one type of potential manipulation with Tether. There are a whole bunch of other kinds of manipulation in this market that have been sort of out in the open that people know about. There are these pump and dump schemes that people do where they'll get on and say, okay, I'm going to push up the price right now. Everybody get in. And, everybody tries to get in before it's too late. And it's not clear if that's illegal in the stock markets. It's not clear if that's illegal in Bitcoin markets. And I think similarly, what's happening with Tether, it's not clear what laws apply here. And so a lot of stuff happens in these markets because A, it's not clear what the rules are, and B, it's not clear which regulators are in charge. Because these are these international markets. Bitfinex is sort of ostensibly located in either the Caribbean or Asia. And so if the United States had laws barring this, would the United States have jurisdiction to crack down on them? It seems like probably they do. And in fact, there is evidence, we've reported that some American regulators have subpoenaed Bitfinex and asked for records. And so it seems like American regulators in particular are asserting themselves in these markets and saying, yes, there are rules. And particularly now because there are American exchanges that trade contracts related to Bitcoin. So that gives regulators an in, and that may be enough in itself. But I think there's so much that's still unclear about what the rules are in these new markets, and who's really watching over them. The main thing, last year when a lot of this was happening, it's just there really wasn't anyone looking over these markets. And Bitfinex, there's nobody who comes to them and says, show us your records, show us your bank accounts. An American stock exchange or a European stock exchange has to prove that it is holding customer money in the right way and has the accounts that it says it has. And at this point, virtual currency exchanges just don't have to do that.
So we mentioned your book earlier that you wrote about Bitcoin, digital gold, Bitcoin, and the inside story of the misfits and millionaires trying to reinvent money. That was 2016. That's 2 years. What are the biggest changes or biggest surprises you've seen between writing your book and now?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that has happened in the last few years since I wrote my book. I mean, my book was, really about the beginnings of Bitcoin and how this thing arose out of nothing to essentially become this industry. And I think probably the biggest thing that's happened since then is that you've had this whole proliferation of other virtual currencies. And that, started with big ones like Ether and XRP, which did exist when my book came out. But now you just have thousands of them. And in particular, you have this whole market of initial coin offerings where people raise money by selling tokens. And create custom new virtual currencies. And that, I think, is something that really nobody saw coming, certainly 2 years ago. And it was the story last year. It's where regulators are focusing a lot of their attention these days. But I think going back to my book, the first 5 years, in many ways, are the same story as what's happening now, which is this constant struggle between the kind of decentralized law-breaking impulses around cryptocurrencies, the degree to which they're international and outside of the scope of regulators, and these efforts to kind of rein it in, and these efforts by businesses to try to find a way to kind of harness this. And that's really been there since the beginning, and it's still very much the story today.
Yeah. This is a fast-changing kind of field, and trying to keep up with it is a little bit of a challenge. But Nathanial Popper,
even for me,
yeah, I'm sure. I mean, it's changing so rapidly. But we will definitely be in touch. It's awesome getting you on the show and getting your insight into this. Nathanial Popper with the New York Times. Anywhere you want to point people to find your work?
My Twitter account at Nathanial Popper is, where I'm updating things the most frequently. But obviously, writing about this, very frequently for the New York Times. So had something out yesterday, something new out today about Steve Bannon and his interest in the space. So you never know. I never even know where it's going to go next.
Sounds like an interesting and exciting beat then to be on top of.
Yes.
So Nathanial, thank you for joining us today. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me.
All right, take care.
Well, the gaming and entertainment conference E3 is wrapping up today in Los Angeles, and here to talk to us about the announcements we care about is Justin Haywald, managing editor at Gamespot. Welcome to the show, Justin.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So what was the biggest highlight of this year's show for you?
It's hard to find one highlight when you have a year like this, which is really just all about the games. Like for me, it's getting to see a first look at some games that I've been personally looking forward to for a long time, like Super Smash Brothers on the Nintendo Switch, The Last of Us Part 2 from Sony. Like, there's just a lot of really cool games coming up really soon.
What about indie games? Do you have any favorite indie games that were announced?
I don't know about too many indie games that were announced, but for me personally, the Double Fine guys have some really fun, just really cute, amazing titles. Knights and Bikes is one from the guys who used to do Little Big Planet. Ooblets is this husband and wife team who are making a game that's kind of like a cross between Pokemon and like a farming simulator, and it's absolutely adorable. It's called Ooblets. It's probably one of my favorite indie games at the show.
I've in kind of taking a look at the different points, the different Microsoft, Sony, Nintendo, all the players that had announcements there. It's interesting to see how each of them were rated, but Microsoft really seemed to come out on top. Why was that? Why was Microsoft so successful at this year's E3? And do you think this signals kind of a good kind of venture into their next console, the next Xbox, whenever that may happen?
Yeah, I think one of the problems that Microsoft might have had, or one of the problems people might have perceived, is that 2018 is kind of light on titles. And for them, this was coming forward and saying, like, no, publishers really want to create content for us. That not only do we have a lot of stuff coming up in 2018 that's going to run really well in the Xbox One X, for their press conference, they got the first look at games like Fallout 76, at Cyberpunk 2077. And I think those are the kinds of things that really filled people more with confidence, that even though maybe Microsoft's first party in 2018 isn't as strong as you might think, what they have coming up in the future is still really exciting. And the other thing that came out of that press conference was them talking about upcoming partnerships and new studios that they've formed. So I think the future for Microsoft and what people saw at the press conference filled them with a lot more optimism about the company.
Yeah, what you mentioned Fallout 76. I'm very curious about that one. What was your takeaway on that? What are your thoughts?
You know, I was definitely skeptical when it was first announced because it's not called Fallout 5. Anytime you have a sequel or another game coming up that doesn't follow numerically, doesn't follow sequentially, right, you wonder if it's going to be a true predecessor, if it's really going to take the graphics, or if it's going to be something that might seem a little bit more toned down, if it's something that maybe is going for a broader audience. You saw something like Fallout Shelter last year, which is a mobile game, which I think is a lot of fun, and I think definitely got a lot of people interested in Fallout, but isn't in that same Fallout franchise. And the thing that I was really excited about is that Fallout 76 looks like a true Fallout game. Like for me, some like, you know, a big gamer being able to be in that Fallout world with the same mechanics that I know and love from previous games, I'm excited to see what Fallout 76 has in store.
So one of the interesting announcements I heard was Minecraft Story Mode is coming to Netflix. And Minecraft Story Mode is sort of like the storification. It's like the opposite of a novelization. It's like turning a video game into a story. You don't play it, you just watch it. What do you think? Do we have any idea what that's going to look like on Netflix?
It's really interesting what the Telltale guys, so those are the developers behind this, and their partnership with Microsoft on the Minecraft series. It's interesting what they've done narratively. So the Telltale guys, I think, came to prominence with The Walking Dead and being able to tell these stories from a really popular television and comic book series and put it into a very narrative-focused game. And I think that's the kind of thing that really fits well with Netflix, because you're telling these really entertaining, interesting stories. And it's something that even if there's really mild choices to make, you have a set beginning, middle, and end that for a story set in the Walking Dead universe that they're trying to tell. And I think that's the kind of thing that works really well on Netflix.
Right. Yeah, I guess I said it was you just watch it, you don't play it, but you do play it. It's like a choose your own adventure type thing.
Exactly, and like that's something you can do with a television remote. Like you just select binary choices, and for something like Telltale, it's not necessarily about, you know, twitch reflexes or those kinds of things that we think about with games normally. It really is just about experiencing that story at your own pace.
Yeah, I'm really curious to hear how Netflix, like what their numbers have been. They actually rolled this out initially last year with the Puss in Boots series, that cartoon series, and you know the longest it would play is 39 minutes depending on how you played it, and my kids played it a handful of times and then they kind of forgot about it and moved on. But it's an interesting approach, right? But it kind of flies in the face of this idea that when we sit down to watch something, you know, we're not necessarily looking for it to be interactive or thinking about Netflix as like a gaming platform, which is basically what they're talking about.
Yeah, and what gaming means, I think, is something that's constantly evolving. Like when you think about the gaming industry being bigger than television, being bigger than movies, it's because the definition of gaming is just so incredibly broad. Like my mom might not consider herself a gamer, but the amount of time that she spends on mobile titles, she probably dwarfs me as far as the amount of time she spent on something like Pokemon Go.
What about esports? Were esports big at E3 this year?
You know, esports, I think, still has a lot to prove, but the thing that's been really interesting at E3 has been Fortnite. Like that's not not only something that's just captured imaginations as far as what a title that comes out of nowhere that's free to play can do as far as audience and capturing people's and capturing the things that people want to play. But they also announced that they're going to have a $100 million prize pool for their tournament this year. And that's the kind of thing, as far as esports go, that I think people can relate to maybe better than something like one of the biggest esports now is League of Legends. It's something that draws huge audiences, but is a very complicated game, can be something that's very hard to watch. Something like Overwatch from Blizzard, which is a first-person shooter, I think is a little bit easier to parse for someone who might not understand those games as well. But Fortnite does that a whole nother step better. It's something where maybe you don't necessarily need to see the direct avatar of the person who's playing. You can watch the action. It's very cartoony. It's something that's easy to understand. And that makes me feel like esports is going to really start to hit its stride starting this year.
Yeah. And then one thing I couldn't help but notice is that, Nintendo stock kind of dropped post E3. Why was that? Were their announcements more disappointing than others, or did they just not come with much new, or what was the story there?
Yeah. I think Nintendo definitely had a good showing for fans. Super Smash Brothers is one of those really highly anticipated titles that's going to sell really, really well for Nintendo for a long time. But it's not necessarily a big risk. It's not a big chance. And I think that's the kind of thing that people like to see from Nintendo, is when they do things that are really outside the norm. And I don't know if I'd expect them to do that at E3. E3 is when they are going to be serving their core consumer base. And before this, when they had Nintendo Labo, like those are the kinds of things I think that people like to see and that drive stock prices up, because they're taking a risk, they're taking a chance, and they're doing something that could be really wildly successful, like the Switch itself.
And then another disappointment I read about, but this one, like, seriously so. A lot of people were disappointed with what they heard from Square Enix. And apparently this was their first E3 press event in years. In this case, it kind of seemed like a lot of the stuff that they came with had already been announced. So was this just a lack of excitement because people were already very aware of what was going to happen on stage?
Yeah. For E3, I think especially people like to see, like to get a taste or a tease of what's new and what's upcoming. And I think Sony made it clear beforehand that they were just going to focus on a few key titles. But even still, like, I think you do have to go a little bit bigger with E3. You like even that tease. That's what Microsoft did so well, is that even if they don't have console news to announce, they still were talking about, like, no, we have new consoles that we're announcing soon that we're working on. They have a streaming service. We have no idea what it's like. We have no idea what those details are. But giving that tease for something like E3 is what captures attention.
Well, you can read all of Justin's coverage, all of his team's coverage at GameSpot. Justin Haywald is the managing editor at GameSpot and is Justin Haywald on Twitter. Thanks so much for coming on.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you, Justin. We'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.
All right, up next, the children are our AI future. But first, this episode, sorry, I got facepalm from Burke. Yay, I've succeeded. This episode of Tech News Weekly is brought to you by LastPass. Secure every password-protected entry point to your business with LastPass Enterprise. I'm a huge fan of LastPass, been using it for years. Love it. Over 81% of breaches are caused by weak or reused passwords. LastPass protects every password in your business without slowing down your employees. From easy onboarding to password autofill, which I love, to automated security reports, LastPass makes it easy for businesses to take control of passwords and reduce the threat of breach. LastPass Enterprise simplifies password management for companies of every size with the tools you need to secure your business while centralizing control of employee passwords and their apps. Every employee has their own secure vault for managing their passwords. You can set master password requirements, restrict access to specific devices and locations, enable password resets, and a whole lot more. LastPass makes password sharing convenient for employees while still keeping access to corporate data secure. Sensitive data, of course, is encrypted at the device level with AES 256 to protect from man-in-the-middle attacks. And I mean, we are a LastPass house. We use it personally. I use it personally. We also use it for the business, and it makes it really easy to kind of combine those accounts together so that you have access to everything with one login. It's really nice. If you want to take control of your personal passwords, LastPass offers solutions for everyone, for individuals and small teams, as well as LastPass Premium for personal use, LastPass Families for your entire family, LastPass Teams for teams of 50 or less. At work and at home, fix your password woes with LastPass, the #1 most preferred password manager. You can learn more at LastPass.com/twit today. That's LastPass.com/twit and see which product is right for you. And we thank LastPass for their support of Tech News Weekly.
Our next guest calls AI the major driver of what some are calling the fourth industrial revolution. But like so much of Silicon Valley, the folks driving all look remarkably similar. And that is a problem. Welcome, Lauren Smiley, author of the recent piece in The Atlantic, "The Future of AI Depends on High School Girls."
Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thanks for coming. So first, let's start by talking a little bit about Stephanie Tina, the 16-year-old programmer from your story.
Yeah, so I wanted to write this story about this new program. Well, actually, it's in its 4th year now. It's called AI for All, and it's a summer camp at Stanford to expose girls to AI, while they're still in high school. And I was looking at a lot of their the girls. They keep a blog on Medium, and I was sort of like reading up on all the various things they're doing. And I was really struck by Stephanie's story, and then ended up talking to her several times for the story. So Stephanie lives in Salinas, California, and she's the daughter of a farm worker there, a Mexican immigrant mother who picks strawberries in the Salinas Valley there. But she, starting in junior high, got really into coding. They had a program there at the local community college called Coder Dojo, that introduced her to coding, and she really took to it and was quite talented at it. And so wants now to go into computer science and has been seeking out these programs to like increase her skills there. And I must say, like, Stephanie is one of these teen girls that I'm like, I'll talk to you in 10 years, I'm sure, for another story when you were like running, the AI program at Microsoft Research or at another huge tech company, and you're outbidding me for a house in the Bay Area, I'm sure. And I say that quite happily. She's like a success story in a time where we all could use a little bit of optimism, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So what kind of computer science background is required to get involved with this, or like what is the baseline knowledge going into this? Because I know AI for All, it's open to ninth graders at the time that they do their application. Do they have to already have some sort of a computer science background through the school in order to jump right in, or is this like starting from square one, we're going to teach you everything you need to know about AI?
I don't think they require you to come in already with like awesome coding chops or anything like that. I think they will start people from the baseline of 0 if that is where you're coming from. Because part of the whole purpose of the program is to get like a new crowd of people that haven't necessarily been exposed to all these things and, their everyday lives into this field. And so they try not to create, like needless hurdles at the starting gate there for them to get into the program. But this AI for All, they've actually expanded in this summer. It's going to be happening on 6 different campuses across the United States and 1 in Canada as well. And focusing not just on girls. The Stanford one continues to be focused on girls, but they also are, some are for like people from just disadvantaged backgrounds. Others are specifically for racial minorities. And then in all of them, anyone can apply for these programs. They're not like only these people can apply, but they do focus on trying to get new people into this pipeline of talent.
And one of the things you mentioned in your article is, although Stephanie had a background in computer science, she didn't have much of a background in AI, which is really what so many people are talking about now. And what I loved about your piece is it makes this point that is so familiar that when we start to worry about a new technology, we're often worrying about the wrong thing. So what we mostly hear about is like, oh, AI is going to steal our jobs. It's going to we're going to be the robots' pets, et cetera. But really, the real problem, which is not a future problem, but right here, is that the AI is being created by a lot of the people that look exactly the same, and these different alternative voices aren't creating it. And talk a little bit about what kind of problems that can cause. Yeah.
So as far as I can tell, they have statistics on, I think, about a fourth of computer scientists at this point are women. But in AI specifically, there's not like super tangible statistics on this. So most people go by the attendance at this big conference called NIPS. It's like kind of the most prestigious conference in artificial intelligence. And at this point, I think in last year's NIPS conference, there was just 17% women at the conference. And so it's thought that it's actually a lower percentage of women in AI than in engineering as a whole. This is kind of a problem because, as I was talking about in the story, a lot of people are worried right now about biases being built into algorithms. Like if you don't really police your training set of data that you're feeding into these machine learning algorithms to begin with, like the resulting, the result is that it's going to be a bias. It's going to, when you release it into the wild, it's also going to produce biased results. And so there's actually, the beginnings of a cottage industry of like consultants that will actually check your algorithm for bias. There's a few places that are starting to get into this, because too often what we see is that the algorithms that are now determining who gets a loan or who's going to get a job interview, apply online, or, who is going to get bail from jail or be able to get parole from jail. These are all being driven by algorithms, and they're kind of held in black boxes, and they're making decisions in some very public, things of public interest as far as like who's going to get out of jail. But it's like a proprietary algorithm that people cannot see, what is actually going into that decision, and that gets very problematic.
I think what's enlightening to me is, the flip side of this, of course, and what we've talked about already, is this idea that representation in technology, something we've talked about a lot on this show, it really does have a long-standing, problem with being, represented across the board. It's very often focused on a very specific set of people, and so that alternative or that outside view, outside of those people's experiences, aren't considered, and that results in what you're talking about, these kind of biased results from an AI algorithm, let's say. But I think the opportunity here is that AI as a technology force really seems to be at its infancy, right? Like it's not very often that you take a look at a technology and you can kind of recognize while you're in it that this is the beginning of something really big, that 10, 15 years from now, this thing right now, it has the potential to explode to something that is world shaping. And yet we're kind of there right now, it feels like, with AI. We're still in that infancy. And this is a great opportunity to kind of rewrite those rules so that, women and underrepresented minorities of all types can get into it. Is that really what this project is all about?
Yeah, totally. I think it is seen that, like, look, this is what's going to driving like the next revolution in technology. You have the biggest tech companies out there all realigning around AI and trying to build out their programs. There's a bit of an AI sort of arms race going on in Silicon Valley, and even between, the United States and other countries, like who is going to come to be the real, master of this new technology. And so this is sort of the Wild West days where it's in its infancy. And so it's important to attack the, pipeline problem of talent right now, because this is something we'll be dealing with, of course, in 10 years. And so we might as well be getting, teenage girls at age 15, 16, interested in this, so that in 10 years they can be working in this industry. Mm-hmm.
So there's the problem, like the specific problems with the algorithm that you're talking about. Like Siri is less likely to recognize a female voice than she is a male voice. We all know the story of Google thinking an African-American woman was a gorilla. But then there's also the problem of what we're using AI, the problems we're using AI to solve. Our next guest is going to talk about scooters and in the city. And so that problem is like, oh, I don't want to walk from, where the Uber drops me off all the way to, the next block for my tech job. But they're solving, these girls are solving real problems from their own experience. Stephanie was trying to solve water treatment problems, because she grew up in Salinas, as you talked about, the daughter of farmers. When you went and saw some of the projects that these girls were working on, talk a little bit about specifically what they were using this AI to help solve.
So I was sort of blown away. So I went this spring, they had sort of like a follow-up program. So they all did the summer camp last summer. And then the girls who wanted to, they were part of this mentoring program this last spring, where they worked with like an industry mentor, someone from one of these companies in Silicon Valley. And they worked on a project for, I think it was about 2 months' time, checking in with the mentor throughout. And so I went to the graduation for this program. I was over at UC Berkeley on a Saturday, and all of these girls, it was like 12 girls and 1 boy at the program. And they all presented their research projects. And I was sufficiently, not being in AI, do not do this myself. I was sufficiently confused by what they were doing to get their results. But like the projects they had taken on were pretty incredible. Like one girl was trying to detect, wildfire here in California by using drone footage, like with the idea that drones would go over, circulate over the, forested areas of California and be able to detect if there was a fire starting or smoke was starting. And so you could like attack the fire quicker. That was obviously, rooted in her own experience, living here in California where we've had crazy wildfires in the past few years. Another girl was trying to fight online bullying, people using, snarky remarks on social media to detect that. And let's see, another one was working on a better way to suggest music, going off of, the music you've liked in the past. I think her mentor was from Pandora, which made sense.
Oh, yeah.
And then they were actually quite ambitious. And then this one team I talked to, they were trying to figure out a way to get paramedics out to the most, basically a triage system of get paramedics out to the most severe emergencies first, and not be spending your time on something not as important. And that was actually based in this one student's own experience that her grandmother had died after suffering a stroke in San Francisco about a year ago. Because, there was no paramedic to quickly, respond. This is what she was explaining to the group. And so that is what her, her team of 3 had gone after. And it was really impressive. And not just impressive to me, but this Princeton professor who is one of the founders of AI for All stood up at the end and was like, wow, I was expecting you had played around with some data here, but these were actual, undergrad level presentations you've come up with here. So.
Man, that's crazy, and that's the starting point too. It's that's so amazing. Now you point out at the very end of your article, not to spoil the ending, but I guess apparently I'm going to do that. That your subject Stephanie was not at this event because the mentor had kind of dropped off the radar, so to speak. So have you checked in with Stephanie kind of since then? What's going on there?
Yeah, so, I was never given a great explanation of exactly what happened. It's just her mentor kind of didn't come through in the end. So she's continuing her project, right now with another mentor. They reassigned her to someone else. And she's continuing her, water contamination, machine learning project that she's working on. And she's going to present hers at this summer's Stanford summer camp to awesome. Incoming high school girls that are there. So...
Well, I was going to spoil more of the article, but I won't. So go to read it. It's at The Atlantic. Lauren is a reporter and a writer whose work has appeared in The Atlantic, Wired, San Francisco Magazine, and others. You can find her at Lauren Smiley on Twitter. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, we'll talk to you soon. Best of luck.
All right. Goodbye.
Love them or hate them, electric scooters, whatever you want to call them, seem to be all, okay, maybe some of the rage in places like San Francisco. I've personally not experienced it myself yet, but apparently not too long ago, you couldn't walk anywhere without tripping over e-scooters that had been, parked on the sidewalk for other potential users to hop onto and ride to wherever they happen to be going, for a fee, of course. Joining us to talk about this phenomenon and whether it's actually a big deal is Alex Wilhelm, editor-in-chief at Crunchbase News. How's it going, Alex?
I'm good. I'm happy to talk about this because I have ridden the scooters and I can tell you about their wily and fun ways.
Okay, so you've ridden them. Have you ever tripped over them, though? That's the real question.
I've got 2 eyes in the front of my head, and what they allow me to do is see things before I step on them. And in SF, you develop pretty much a second sense to not step in things you don't want to.
Yes.
And so if you've been here for more than 5 minutes, missing a scooter is not hard. You just walk around it magically, and then you don't trip on it. It's amazing.
All right, that's a very good point. There's plenty of other things you actually don't want to step on in San Francisco. So you've ridden these scooters. What do you think? Is this the new big deal? Is there a reason for this whole category to have such excitement behind it?
Well, what I really wanted to do is kind of come on and be cynical and say to you, oh, this is just lame. It's the kids. It's for the youths. But the problem is scooters are actually a lot of fun, and they're very, very, very efficient. So if you live in a place that's flat, and a lot of SF is flat, Soma and FiDi and so forth, getting around is very tough today because of traffic, which is awful. Scooters really fit an amazing market point that wasn't really filled before. And so, as I think about this, I can see them being compelling 5 years from now if the companies behind them get their business models in order. And there's a lot of open questions about that, but it's such early days, it's hard for me to say if that's going to work or not. But I think the demand and the market use case will persist for at least a half decade.
So there's sort of that last mile of transportation, and it's what like Amazon is dealing with too, just getting to that last mile. I mean, Amazon, the last mile is really perhaps a mile, where you're maybe talking about a block or two. How much does it cost to ride one of these scooters?
Yeah, so it's surprisingly cheap. It's $1 to unlock a scooter, if I recall the pricing correctly, and then about 15 cents a minute. So let's say I was going to go from here, I'm at TechCrunch right now, back to my office, which is about a mile away. That might take me, I don't know, say 10 minutes on a scooter, more or less. So that would be $2.50 for me to get from here back to work, which is cheaper than a bus by a quarter. And also, I wouldn't have to wait. I wouldn't have to sit next to someone who hated me, the whole thing. So from that perspective, it's quite compelling.
All right, so there's a little movement here, whether you like it or not. SF seems to not like it very much. They recently mandated that all of these rental scooters be removed from the streets. That's as of last week, and apparently, poof, like that, they're all gone. What do you think this means for the few businesses that are kind of in on this right now? Obviously, they're probably scrambling to kind of do the necessary things to put them back on the street. But how does this affect them?
Yeah, well, it affects competition quite a lot, because one thing that's going to happen is there's going to be 5 slots for scooter companies here in San Francisco. So let's presume you're Bird or you're Lime, the two kind of leading companies in the space. Then you have maybe Uber and Lyft each trying to get into the space. Then you also have Spin, which is a new company. And there's also another one called, I actually forget its name. There's too many scooter companies. But there's not going to be enough chairs at this dance for everyone to sit down. So from a regulatory perspective, we're going to see some companies lose out on the SF market just because of the way the government's going to structure things. And I'm curious to see if that provides kind of an incumbent advantage to certain players that then precludes smaller companies from actually being able to elbow their way in to what could have been a more competitive and interesting market. So I'm not sure if the regulation will harm the companies as much as we think, and it may actually aid them down the road when they don't have to deal with pesky upstarts like they were about 2 months ago.
So when you actually run the numbers in your piece, and it's interesting because, I mean, it makes some sense why these investors are throwing so much money at these companies. And there's a lot of comparison to Uber, but scooter companies actually own the vehicles, where Uber doesn't really own the vehicles. But Uber has to deal with all those pesky, humans driving the cars for now. Like, how do those two factors weigh into the financials of success?
Yeah, so the thing about Uber is a really good point. So when you take an Uber X, you're riding in someone else's car. And 99.9% of the time, that's not a car that Uber controls or owns per se. So it's that person's car. So they take on the maintenance costs, the fuel costs, the insurance costs mostly. And so Uber doesn't take on a lot of expenses for that ride. To your point for the scooters, just so everyone gets it, is that these companies that are raising all this money now are buying scooters and deploying them on the market themselves and maintaining them. It's a pretty different business model. But one thing to throw in there is that people are going to get hurt on these scooters. We know this. People are going to fall off. They're going to get hit by cars. And honestly, I don't mean to sound macabre, but people are going to die. And I'm curious if the legal perspective changes if you own the device and the service that the person's riding on when they die. And I don't know if that changes your legal exposure, but it feels to me like it should. And if that is the way this works out, we could see their cost structure look a little bit worse than Uber's, go to looking a lot worse than an Uber or a Lyft, because they own the hardware and they own more of the legal exposure. That's a pretty tough mix. But at the same time, people are betting heavily that this is going to work out. So at a minimum, we may be pessimistic about some parts of it, but they're not short of new funds. I mean, they've raised hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. But, for me, with my skeptical kind of like broken brain, I don't get how that part of the companies work.
And so do you have to sign something saying you're going to wear a helmet when you get on the scooter?
Megan, I don't mean to be rude, but when's the last time we've read anything when we signed up for anything? I probably did. I don't know is the answer to that. But who knows if those will even hold up? I mean, for all I know, I signed it and gave away my apartment. I don't know. They do say things like you have to wear a helmet, and no one does. And they say things like don't ride it on the sidewalk, and then we all do. So I don't know if anyone's even listening to the things they're making more plain, let alone the more obtuse parts of the contract involving litigation or what's the thing when you have to talk. It's not litigation, but to solve the problem, you have to go to a dispute place to talk it out.
Like a mediation.
Yes, exactly. I don't know what the rules are there, but it'll be interesting to see. All this boils down to me to one thing: scooters are fun, and they're more fun than they are dorky, and that's powerful because they're pretty dorky, and people wouldn't ride them if they weren't really fun.
They're more fun than dorky for you, Alex, in your opinion.
I mean, have you ever seen me on a scooter? It's pretty bad. There's no dignity. There's no like, oh, he looks okay. It's like, there's a nerd on small wheels. Look at him go. And it's still more fun than that. So
yeah, it's one of those things like don't knock it till you tried it. You might think it's nerdy. Well, I haven't either, but you might think it's nerdy, and then you try it, and then you realize it's fun.
Yeah.
If you guys ride these scooters and come back, I'm going to haunt you with this segment when you mocked them. And I'm going to say, see, they were funner than you expected. And you'll say, yes, they were.
I'm just kind of fascinated by, the how rapidly this became a thing. And suddenly, we're talking about $200 million, the e-scooter company Bird looking to raise $200 million, valuation of $2 billion. I mean, and this during a time where we're very accustomed to relatively brand new companies suddenly being worth billions upon billions of dollars out of nowhere. But I don't know, it's impressive to me. And the direct correlation to ride sharing companies like Uber and Lyft, I mean, I'm sure there are lessons there that these companies can learn from as far as what Uber and Lyft have dealt with at this point. They've kind of taken some of the lumps for these e-scooter companies, right?
Yes, very much so. I mean, I think Uber and Lyft have broken down a lot of regulatory barriers that may have been in place. But one thing that I think Bird has been trying to do is run the Uber playbook. Uber would show up to a market, not follow the rules, attract a very large user base quickly. Because back when they were expanding inside the US, they were kind of the hot thing. Everyone said, oh, great, Uber is now in Cleveland or whatever. And then the state would go, or the city would go, oh, this is bad. You're breaking all the rules. And then Uber would turn to its new user base and say, hey, guys, petition the city government, get them off our back. Don't you want to take Uber? And then they would kind of steamroll. Now, Bird has tried this, if I recall correctly, a little bit. So they're not only picking up some of the good stuff from Uber and Lyft, the kind of battles that have already been fought, they're picking up some of the less good, more aggressive tactics. And as Uber tries to mature into a sustainable company, maybe that's not the lesson you want to pick up from Uber. Maybe you want to learn some of the new ones that Dara, the new CEO, is putting into place. But I think there's similarities in tone and substance here.
Well, what about the comparison to the bike share? Because I mean, that seems to be also an equal, a good comparison. But I guess bikes are a little bit harder to ride than scooters. Is that the difference? And then you have to park them somewhere, and they have to be locked up so you don't steal them because you can move them with your own human feet.
Yes. So here I know a little bit less. I'll be very clear, but I do think that the Ford Go Bike sharing program has been pretty successful, at least in San Francisco, and more so since they kind of brought in what are called e-bikes, so bikes that have batteries. So they help you kind of pedal assist up hills, which is pretty important in SF. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we're going to see a massive success of bike sharing companies from companies like Lime that also do scooters. I think they've kind of found that scooters are a much more effective way to deploy capital because, again, you're buying a scooter or a bike. And so I kind of wonder if there's going to be a bit of a skip over the bike sharing model that's very popular in China, Ofo, Mobike, Fugogo, et cetera. And in the U.S., we're going to see mostly scooters because, I mean, there's a lot of cities in the U.S. where I can see these working. Like Austin, downtown Austin is flat and lovely. What a perfect place to scoot around, right? I mean, it's designed for that. Mm-hmm. Why would I want to bike and get sweaty? It's hot in Austin. I don't want to work. I just want to be taken somewhere and deposited in a nice coffee shop. So on the bike front, I just don't expect to see as much momentum. And to Jason's point about how much they're raising and how quickly, that's kind of the mark of you can tell the scooters are more popular because these companies like Lime were doing bikes and weren't growing nearly as fast. So they weren't raising as much money either. So I presume the scooters are what's going to happen. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize, of course.
And do you think there's a possibility that companies like Uber or Lyft might see this as a segment that they want to add to their fleet, either coming out with competitive or competitors in this space or scooping up one of these companies and adding it as another option for what they're doing?
Yeah, the scooping up point's really, really good. And I think probably if I was just to guess, 50% of the market cap of these companies is probably expectation that a current market incumbent's going to buy them. For example, Uber bought, Jump Bike just a couple of months ago for, I think, about $100 million. Maybe it was even 200. But if you're Uber and you're thinking about transportation being a bit more than just getting into a car, trying to plug more into public transit, trying to plug more into walking around, whatever, this is a pretty obvious pickup. But if these companies get too big, they may actually price themselves out of that sort of acquisition, because Bird, having raised $2 billion, isn't going to sell for $2 billion. It's to sell for $4 billion, $6 billion, $8 billion. And even for Uber, that begins to get pretty expensive. So there's kind of a mix of hubris and enthusiasm on the valuation front. But again, I guess for the first time, what an insane moment in the market that we're living through. I mean, 2018 is wild. Yeah, I can't get over how abnormal this is. You know, we're going to look back in 5 years at this conversation as either like the highest point in the market or literally just another step in the transformation of the world. Because if the money stops, these companies are hosts. There's no way they make money. Yeah. So, you know, there better be another round waiting for a long time.
It is interesting because I feel like we've been having these similar conversations with you, Alex, since 2015, at least, if not before. Just those crazy moments. We could probably look back and say we were right about that, wrong about that, right, wrong. But what strikes me is this. It's one of those things like Google Glass where there's a lot of hate. Like you were joking about it, like how dorky you look, or like, you know, you don't want to ride the bus because the person sitting next to you might hate you and think that you're a certain way. But I think that, I mean, it's not just hating the technology. It's like really hating the people that use the technology, the same way people did with Google Glass, which is just a bizarre way that our society, especially in the big cities where there's a lot of gentrification, but the way that our city is functioning or not functioning.
Yeah. But the cool thing about scooters, credit, is that they're not like Google Glass, that they cost tons and tons of money. They're relatively affordable. And so, you know, if you have a smartphone, which is certainly an economic barrier, they're a couple of dollars to ride, which is not bad. Google Glass was thousands of dollars, and it was hard to get into. It was very exclusive. So I think there's a difference there. But I do agree that this is another example of tech getting a bit ahead of the market. And it's going to be curious to see if that leads to anger long-term or just kind of short-term complaints on Reddit, for example.
We'll know it's jumped the shark if everybody riding the scooters is wearing Google Glass. That's when we know it's jumped the shark.
I think you have legal right to push people off scooters if they're wearing Google Glass. I don't think the cops will prosecute you for that. I think that's pretty much a go. So go for it. You heard it here first.
His opinion does not necessarily represent the opinions of our entire
emails to Alex Wilhelm.
Very, very valid. Please send them to Leo at twit.tv.
Oh, great. Alex Wilhelm, it's great to get you back on again. It's been a while. Tell us where people can actually find the podcast that you shut down early in order to make this podcast. And thank you, by the way.
No worries. I'm on a weekly show called Equity. It's a TechCrunch podcast. We talk about venture capital and startups. And ironically, we were talking about scooters about half an hour ago. So I was all primed and ready for this. But if you want to talk about money and you're dorky about it, come hang out on Equity. It's a fun time.
Right on. Cool. Alex, we'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye. All right, and finally, we've talked ad nauseum in the past about how the iPhone, while being incredibly secure in many ways, is still susceptible to certain types of brute force methods of password and PIN cracking, thanks to tailor-made devices by forensic companies like Grayshift and Cellebrite. If law enforcement or even a hacker with access to these systems has physical control over the device, they can then set that hardware to work via the USB port on the phone to systematically attempt any number of combinations while bypassing system settings to wipe the device if a threshold of unsuccessful attempts is passed. We've heard about this time and time again. Apple is now making a big change in the upcoming version of iOS that will effectively deactivate data communication through that port once the device has reached a full hour with no successful unlock performed. And this would, in effect, kill the ability of these hardware solutions to continue for days to try those password combos until it finds the right one to gain access. So this kind of seems like a way where Apple is kind of buttoning up the security on the phone. And I have to imagine law enforcement not very happy with it. Hackers, whatever, they're going to find another way because they always do. Probably so will law enforcement. What do you think?
Yeah, I think law enforcement will pay those hackers to find another way for them.
That's true.
But yeah, I mean, this was most people were most of the headlines basically said like, you know, Apple is trying to thwart law enforcement, but really they're also trying to thwart hackers who use these tools like Greylock. They also use them. Mm-hmm. So this is, and they're not this isn't part of the current operating system. Like you said, it's in the beta, so they might not even be. It's not even in the public beta. It's in the developers beta, so it might be something that they don't end up necessarily using. But yeah, I mean, I think it would be great. Like I thought. For a while, people weren't really stealing iPhones because it was impossible to really be able to access them. But now I think that's happening more. That people are finding ways to get. Yeah. I've certainly heard of more people getting their iPhones stolen because I think there's ways to get into them now.
Yeah, well, and I mean, even some of these systems, you didn't even necessarily need access to the hardware. You could do it on a per phone basis for a flat fee. So. There are ways, and this kind of buttons that up. Apple also did mention that this is, aside from what we've already talked about, this is also meant for users in countries where legal restrictions around, this kind of indirect access are much more lax than they are even here in the U.S. So, so there are a number of reasons why Apple would think this is good for the user, and I would agree. So, Tech News Weekly records live every Thursday, 2:30 p.m. Pacific, 5:30 p.m. Eastern at twit.tv/live. You can also be part of the show by emailing us at tnw@twit.tv.
Subscribe to our show. Go to twit.tv/tnw. You can find all the ways to subscribe. However you listen or watch shows or podcasts, you can even subscribe to our YouTube channel. We wouldn't mind if you did that too. And if you want to tweet at me with your pictures of you on a scooter, I really want to see them. And I am at Megan Maroney, and I promise not to make fun of you.
Oh, we might have it as part of next week's show, but it won't be to make fun of you. It'll be to point out how cool you are. I'm at Jason Howell. Please CC me because I want to see it too. Thanks to Burke. Thanks to Josh. Thanks to Jammer B. I'd thank Colleen, but she's not here today. That's okay, Colleen. You deserve the day off. And thanks to everyone for tuning in this week. We'll see you next week on another episode of Tech News Weekly. Bye, everybody.